Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time. So when we think about the Eisenhower presidency, the image that often comes to mind is, a captain steering a ship. But that's not quite right. A better way to think about it, and the one we're going to dig into, is to see the presidency as a system. Imagine a thermostat, one that's designed to regulate a bomb. It's constantly adjusting, balancing these huge forces like nuclear deterrence and covert action, all for one single purpose: to keep that bomb from ever going off. Our guide for this is Jim Newton's book, Eisenhower, The White House Years. And what Newton really zeroes in on is how Ike had to govern in a brand new world, a world with two enormous new pressures. First, the absolutely terrifying reality of nuclear weapons, and second, this ballooning secret intelligence infrastructure that was growing faster than anyone could really control. And right there, that's the key. If we really want to get what was going on in this era, we've got to look past the man, past his personality. We have to look at the machinery of power that he was managing. See, it's not just about Ike, the person. It's about the Eisenhower system. This really gets to the heart of the paradox of the Cold War, doesn't it? Eisenhower knew that to protect this open, democratic way of life, he might have to rely on methods that were, secretive and totally undemocratic. Methods that could actually threaten the very thing he was trying to defend. That's a huge, huge challenge. And as Newton points out in the book, Ike never, ever shrank from it. So how do you even begin to manage a paradox like that? Well, this is where we come back to our main idea, the presidential thermostat. Think about it. Instead of just being a commander giving orders, the president's job becomes something more subtle. It's about constantly adjusting the temperature of global conflict. You can't let it get too hot because that means all-out nuclear war, but you also can't let it get too cold because that means the Soviets take over. You're always managing the brink.
Okay, let's nail this down. What exactly is this presidential thermostat? Well, it's a system, and it's always under immense pressure. Its primary function, its main job, isn't to win a war in the old-fashioned sense. No, its job is to manage conflict. It does that by constantly tweaking the settings between deterrence and restraint, between being aggressive and being cautious. All of this just to maintain a very, very fragile balance in what was a terrifyingly unstable world.
Okay, so that's the big idea. But how did this thermostat actually work day to day? We can actually see it in action if we break it down into three key patterns, three ways the system regulated itself to keep that delicate balance. All right, the first pattern is this constant push and pull between deterrence and restraint. It's really a story of two different realities, what was said out loud for everyone to hear and what was decided behind closed doors. And here's a perfect example of that thermostat at work. Publicly, the policy was called massive retaliation. This was all about visible strength. The idea was to crank the heat way, way up, let the Soviets know that any aggression would be met with an overwhelming nuclear response. But privately, in the Oval Office and the Situation Room, Eisenhower was all about restraint. He was dead set against using smaller, tactical nukes in a crisis because he was terrified of uncontrollable escalation. So you see the pattern? He projected extreme heat publicly, precisely so he would never have to use it. And this wasn't just a vague feeling. We can see it in his own words. At a National Security Council meeting, he totally shot down the idea that you could have some kind of nice, sweet, limited nuclear war. For him, there was no middle ground. The moment the first nuke was used, no matter how small, that was it. That was the first step toward extinction. This wasn't just another weapon in the arsenal. It was a switch that could end the world. Okay, on to the second pattern, covert action. So if nuclear weapons were the high heat setting on our thermostat, you can think of covert ops as the low temperature tool, a way to get things done without risking a global meltdown. But, and this is a huge but, every time they used this tool, it had a major side effect. It fed and expanded the power of the intelligence system itself. The 1954 coup in Guatemala is a perfect case study of this. This wasn't some one-off, random decision. It was a repeatable, almost mechanical process. Step 1, the system identifies a threat, in this case, the Arbenz government. Step 2, a special task force comes up with a systemic solution, a coup. Step 3, a specific mechanism, the CIA, is activated to get the job done. And here's the kicker, step 4, the operation is seen as a success. And that success reinforces the whole process. It basically proves to the system that this is a great tool, which expands the CIA's role and makes it even more likely they'll use it again. The system literally feeds on its own success.
And that brings us to the third and final pattern. This one shows how the system didn't just operate overseas. It started to reshape America itself. You see, the whole logic of a permanent Cold War, this idea of being constantly ready for a massive war that might never actually happen, that thinking started to seep into everyday civilian life. It led to new kinds of infrastructure, and it created these incredibly deep entanglements between the military and private industry.
So when you pull all these threads together, you start to see why just focusing on Eisenhower's personality, his character, can be really misleading. Yes, of course, he was a huge part of the story, but he wasn't acting in a vacuum. He was operating inside this vast, almost impersonal architecture of power, a system that had its own logic, its own inertia, its own momentum. And you know who understood this better than anyone, at least by the end? Eisenhower himself. That famous farewell address, where he warns everyone about the military-industrial complex, that wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark. It was a frankly stunning admission from the very man who had overseen its massive growth. He was warning the country about the powerful, self-perpetuating system that he had helped build and manage for 8 solid years. Which really leaves us with one big question, doesn't it? Because this isn't just about Eisenhower or the 1950s. It's about how we see history and power itself. When we boil down these huge, complex events into simple stories about the personality of a single leader, what are we missing? What powerful, invisible systems do we fail to see operating just beneath the surface? This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer, audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.